Hi, welcome back to part 2 of Financial Institutions and Markets, the Financial System and the Aggregate Economy. Let's continue on with our analysis, the 5 questions we left off with. First, who controls the money supply? Usually the government or the central bank is the source of the money in the economy. 2, what drives the level of output? This is usually changes in innovation and technology as well as additional labor. If we can increase the labor force, if we have new technology that we can put into use, we can increase the level of output. What drives prices? Well, all of these factors drive prices. So price in a real world situation probably won't be the input you're given. It will probably be the output that you are calculating based on the other 3 factors. Another way of describing the driver of price is supply and demand. As with anything, when there is a change in supply or demand, then there will be a change in price. There's a market equilibrium balancing supply and demand, and when one of those changes, then price will change. So we can think of price as generally an output resulting from the other inputs. Next, what happens if the money supply is increased, but output level does not increase? So of our 4 variables, money increases, output does not increase. Let's take a look at the whiteboard and analyze this scenario. So in our formula, M times V, money times velocity, equals P times Y, price times output. In the scenario we're analyzing, what happens when money supply increases and output does not increase? So let's look at our changes, our growth rates. Let's say we have a money supply with an increase of 10%, an increase of 0.1, and our output has no increase, 0.0 change. Well, what is the result going to be? We know that we need an equality. So to balance, we either need to have a velocity decrease of 10%, or we can have a price increase of 10%. In either case, the equation is going to balance as a result of the change. If we look at the first scenario, velocity decreases, we would have on the left side of the equation plus 0.1 minus 0.1, which equals 0. And with a change in output of 0, to make the right side complete, we must be adding a price increase of 0. Alternatively, if we look at the situation in which we have a price increase of 10%, then the money supply increase of 10% plus 0 is the only number that will work to make a price increase of 10% balance with an output change of 0. So either velocity increases to offset the money supply increase, velocity decreases to offset the money supply increase, or prices increase to match the money supply increase. And our final question is, how does a change in velocity affect inflation? Let's do this analysis also on the whiteboard. Our formula, MV equals PY. And the question is, how do velocity and price relate to each other or interact? Let's assume that our money supply and our output have no change. Let's set those at 0. And we want to make our equation balance, of course, so we can see now with only 2 variables to analyze, one on each side of the equation, they need to go the same direction. If we have a velocity increase, then we will have a price increase. If we have a velocity decrease, then we will have a price decrease. When we take the money supply and the output out of the equation, or we assume both of those have the same movement or is no movement, then velocity on one side of the equation must match the movement of price. Or another way of stating that is, if velocity goes up, prices will go up. If velocity goes down, prices will go down. Let's talk about financial wealth and how financial wealth affects spending, or how financial wealth affects the aggregate economy. Financial wealth can be created in two ways. One is through new investment, whether that's in real assets or financial assets, and another is in the change in value of existing real or financial assets. So when we have an increase in value of assets, the result is people feel wealthy and they tend to spend more money. In order to prevent that increased spending from resulting in inflation, central banks often will raise interest rates. That will decrease the amount of borrowings in the economy. And so when people are spending more, there's more real economy activity, more aggregate economy activity. Higher interest rates will offset that slightly to prevent or reduce the amount of borrowing that might normally happen if people are looking, or companies are looking to make new investment. And so that's how a central bank, that's how a country will try and control the increased economic activity by raising interest rates. That's one way of managing the economy and preventing or minimizing inflation. On the other hand, when there is a decrease in asset values, then people feel poor, they tend to spend less, and a country will want to encourage spending, and central banks tend to lower interest rates in these situations. Lower interest rates encourage borrowing. Borrowing isn't as expensive. Loans aren't as expensive because of the lower interest rate, and so there will be some offset in the economic slowdown due to the decrease in asset values. The offset is lower interest rates encourage individuals and companies to borrow and do some spending, even though they might not be as motivated as they normally would be given the decrease in asset values. Let's look at a supply and demand analysis of financial assets. One comment I want to make in this supply-demand curve is this is a normal supply-demand curve. We learned last week that sometimes when we look at supply and demand in finance, we invert the supply-demand curve. Sometimes we have the demand curve going up and the supply curve going down. In this case, we're using the normal format. The supply curve is going up and the demand curve is going down. So let's see what's happening in this situation. We have a change in supply. So let's talk about what's causing the change in supply. First, what creates equilibrium in our financial asset supply and demand is interest rates. So I see at point 1, I have my equilibrium, a certain amount of funds available for borrowing, and an interest rate at which those funds are available for borrowing. That interest rate and that funds level matches the demand of funds by individuals and companies and the supply of funds by lenders. The individuals and companies want as low of a rate as possible. The lenders want as high of a rate as possible. This is the equilibrium rate. So what changes the supply? Well, let's say that there is an increase in income. So there's additional money available in the economy, or there's financial innovation, and that creates an incentive. That creates more interest in providing money for borrowing. So one example would be a new tax rule that says interest income is tax-free. Well, if interest income was taxable, and now it's tax-free, that's going to create interest on the part of people with money to lend more. Now they can realize a tax-free form of income that used to be taxable. So at the same interest rate, they're actually going to put more money in their pocket. So these could create an increase in supply. What happens when the supply increases? Well, at the same interest rate, there isn't enough demand. Look at where we're at the original equilibrium point. There isn't enough demand at this interest rate to use that extra money. So what has to happen is the interest rate has to come down. Notice that our change in supply results in a decrease in the interest rate. And that decreased interest rate creates an increase in demand for that money. Individuals and companies are more interested in borrowing now that the interest rate has gone down. So what we see here in this supply and demand analysis is that something is changing the supply. Something is increasing the supply of money, lendable funds in the market, either an increase in income or financial innovation that's favorable to the lender, favorable to the investor, and that creates a shift in supply that results in more money in the market. In order to absorb those additional funds, then the interest rate goes down. That increases the interest of individuals and companies to borrow the money, and we have a new equilibrium interest rate, which is lower than our starting rate. And finally, let's look at a scenario of government intervention in the financial markets through an interest rate ceiling. In the supply-demand curve, we have an equilibrium market rate, which is higher than what the government wants to be in place. The government wants to put an interest rate ceiling in place to keep the interest rate low, to encourage businesses to invest and create growth in the economy. So let's see, and that sounds good. Well, let's see what the result is of that ceiling. Well, when the interest rate is lower than the equilibrium rate, a couple of things happen. Yeah, the interest rate is low, and that encourages borrowers to borrow, but it discourages lenders from lending. So let's see what's happening on the funds axis, on the x-axis. The funds supplied and the funds demanded don't balance. They're not the same number. There is a shortage. The shortage means there's not enough. The banks don't want to lend. The interest rate isn't attractive enough to them to get them interested in the market. And at the same time, a lot of companies love the low interest rate, and a lot of companies want to get in and borrow at this low rate. They see that this gives them an opportunity to pursue new growth projects. So two results of the interest rate ceiling. One, banks don't want to get in the game and make the loans to the companies who need them. And too many companies are getting in the game. As a result, some projects that shouldn't be funded are going to be funded. Let's talk about why that is happening. At the market rate, let's say that this market rate is a 10% interest rate. At a 10% interest rate, a company doesn't want to borrow for a project that has a return lower than 10%. You don't want to borrow at 10% if your project is only going to return, say, 8%. And let's use that number as the ceiling. Let's say the ceiling is set at 8%. And so now, let's take a project that has a projected return of 9%. For a company who has a 9% investment return opportunity, an 8% loan looks great. The financial effects will work in their favor. The financial leverage will work in their favor. But what should really be happening is that lenders should be able to get a 10% return on their money, a 10% interest rate, and that should shut out any project that has a return less than 10%. With the ceiling in place, then projects between 8% and 10% are in a situation that give an attractive look to the financial analysis. Again, a project with a 9% return looks attractive when financing is available at 8%. And so too many projects are in the market for lenders to analyze, and what might happen is, because of the funds shortage, lenders analyzing all of these projects might miss a good 10% or 12% or 15% return project and accept what may be a good project, but the return is only 8% or 9%, and those projects really shouldn't be getting financed. So the result is an inefficient financial market. Government's good intentions are to keep the interest rate low, encourage corporate investment, encourage economic growth, but the result is that lenders stay out of the market, too many projects come into the market, and there's an inefficient financial market result in the end. So it usually works best to let the market determine what the right interest rate is. That's not to say that government intervention is never a good idea. That certainly wouldn't be a true statement. That wouldn't be an accurate statement. But it probably is an accurate statement to say most economists would agree that interest rate ceilings don't have a positive effect on the economy. And here we see that being fleshed out in this example. Okay, so this concludes our lecture on the financial system and the aggregate economy. Make sure you work through the exercises accompanying this lecture, and I look forward to seeing you in class for our case study.